Good morning, everyone. Glad you're all here. Glad to see you all survived the week in one piece and all that sort of thing. We just barely made it. You really starved to death. Man, that was a rough one. Anyway, good to be back. I guess it was only one Sunday, but it seems like an awful long time since I was here. I don't know why that is. Hope you had a good time with Eddie last week. And I was up at Toppenish last week and had a good time with folks up there. So now we're back, and we're back in our pre-holiday study of 1 Kings. It must be pre-holiday study of 1 Kings. It'll probably be the post-holiday study of 1 Kings. Maybe for a long time yet. We are in chapter 4, and we're working our way down through there. We're going to be taking up somewhere around verse 20. I think this is our target. See if we can get. And this chapter is kind of out of time sequence. It's not really from, we started out early in his reign, and we've kind of leaped ahead for this chapter. And it seems to be aimed at giving you some confirmation that the things that David was told and the things that Solomon was promised when he went up and made remember all the sacrifices they made, and he prayed and he said, Lord, I just want wisdom. And God said, I'm going to give you that, and I'm going to give you all these other things. And then it rolls right into these other little vignettes of his reign and his rule. And it seems to be put there on purpose by the writer to point at those promises that God made and say, here we can check them off. These are the things that God did for Solomon, and here's some evidence of that. And so we'll look at some more of that evidence this morning. It's most interesting that when you go searching for other information on this, you can get everything from soup to nuts, and I mean literally nuts. You can get everything when you start looking at things like King Solomon's stables and stuff like that. You can get things from archaeological information that's really interesting to guys that are proven to the best of their ability and have websites dedicated to proving that there was no such thing as David and Solomon, there is no such thing as Israel, and the thing about Jews and being a race is all made up. It's amazing what you can find out there. And the comment that someone brought here a couple weeks ago, but they've been reading about when you're doing archaeology now, you can no longer use the Bible as a basis for figuring out where you're going to dig or anything. That's just, you can't do that. If you go out and dig based on something from Babylon or some other writings someplace else, and then happen to find something that supports the Bible, that's okay. But it's really, even within Israel, you're not supposed to do that.
I don't know why they call this guy the naked archaeologist. He's always fully clothed. There's a program on TV that's called The Naked. He uses the Bible to, he carries the Bible with him.
Right.
And he's in Israel and around that country. And,
it's interesting that, it's a whole, even within the Jewish system, government and schools and all that sort of thing, where they have based their archaeology, even now the pressure is on not to do that. And there's one woman who has been doing digs in Jerusalem and research based on things she found in Scripture and saying, I think this is where, based on what I'm reading, we ought to dig. And she's been getting all kinds of flack over that. And I think, was that you that brought that to us?
Yes.
Who was that? Okay.
Yes, she's the granddaughter, I believe, or the daughter of the man that did
that was doing it
and,
before.
And she has found things.
Amazing.
Right.
Yeah, I was reading some of that, and it's really fascinating. But then on the other hand, it was all totally false. So, and then on the other side, I ran into searching for topics on 1 Kings. I ran into a website that goes to great detail, and I'm reading down through it, trying to understand, okay, how's this related to King Solomon and all this sort of thing, and I get down a ways, and they are trying to prove that when you write it out in Hebrew, that President Obama's name is the same as one in Revelation and in the other things, and he's one of the kings of something. Oh man, this is interesting. So, I didn't get too far into that, I had to get back to that. So you learn lots of interesting things. Anyway, but let's begin in, yeah, don't believe it. Everything on the internet is absolutely true.
What color horse is he riding?
You know, I didn't get that far. Well, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 20, because that is an interesting little verse, kind of stands all on its own right there. And it says that Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. And you go, okay, so when you look at that, I need some 5-year-old whys. Remember the 5-year-old why? That's where you look at it and go, why is the sky blue? Why? You know, because the mind is going, why? So there's some things ought to just pop right out at you.
Why are they doing it?
Why are they doing it? Why are they eating and drinking and rejoicing?
Well, they're not at war.
They're not at war. Okay, so no war now. It tells you that.
And strikes me that phrase, numerous as the sands on the seashore,
How
because that's
number?
what God promised.
Have we seen that anywhere before?
God's promise to Abraham.
Let's go to Genesis 22:17. And he says to Abraham in Genesis 22:17, indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Ooh. In fact, it goes on, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Does anybody know if they cheat and look back at their Bible just where that passage occurred? Where in the time frame of things that were happening, what just happened before he got that promise?
Offered up his son.
He offered up his son Isaac. He was told to go to Mount Moriah, and he was right there ready to do it, and God said, hold it. I see that you will now not keep your son back from me. And he raised up his eyes, and there was a ram caught in a thicket, and they sacrificed the ram, and immediately after that, God makes him this promise. So here we are in verse 20, all of a sudden, just out of the blue, there's this little verse, and they were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And what is God trying to tell us?
Well, he keeps his promises.
He says, this is the front, and he's saying, remember the Abrahamic covenant? He says, all of you, remember the Abrahamic covenant? That was just one little piece of the Abrahamic covenant, wasn't it? And interestingly enough, he's given us the psalm, everything is great, there's no war, and they have great, good things going on. And he says there was a promise to Abraham, and why should he want to remind them of that?
But it's if you obey.
Okay, there was the obey was in there. Good point. What else was Abraham? He was promised the land. Remember? Whoop, I'm dying here. He got land, he had the seed, and a blessing. So, you see, if we got Solomon here, any portions of that in this passage we've been studying. How about the land? Remember last time we were together, if you think way back 2 weeks ago, boy, that's a stretch for me. We studied, and it was telling us that there were all these guys with funny names, and they had a responsibility for what? Provisions for providing all the stuff for the kingdom, well, the governing group at Jerusalem. For down here in Jerusalem, they had 12 divisions. And what did those, besides just being, isn't that interesting how they divided up the responsibilities, how far afield did we see the nation influencing and covering at that time?
Greatest that it ever was in history.
Yeah, they went all the way to way over here on the Euphrates River on the west bank. They mentioned the town over there. So it goes way over there, it went clear up here, and it went clear to the border of Egypt. So he had an influence, something like that. Not quite everything that was originally given when the land was given out, because there's some of those areas they have influence over but have not taken possession of. But as close as it's ever gotten to that point in history, probably ever in history, really. So there's a little indication in Solomon's rule of the land part of the promise. What about the blessing part? Well,
I think it's very interesting. I've been listening to David Jeremiah, and he was preaching on, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you, and how our politics are acting right now.
how interesting is it a really good idea to curse Israel? Well, it hasn't been historically a good idea. But if they are, what are they doing? They're eating and drinking
And they're happy.
and happy. Okay, that's easier, right, than rejoicing. Easier to spell anyway. So these are the things they're doing. What does that, why did he tell us that? In those few words,
They're prosperous.
they're very prosperous. They're seeing the blessings of this land that flows with milk and honey. So in Solomon's reign, they're seeing indications of getting out to the land they were promised. They're seeing the blessing. What about the seed? Well, they had to have seed to plant, to have stuff to eat. Hey, there's the farmer in me. No, that wasn't it, was it? The seed is, there he is. David, the promise to David was a son on the throne, and the promise was a lot further than just this guy, wasn't it? It actually goes a long ways down the line. So here they are sitting here, and the writer wants to point out the fact that in Solomon there's the hint of the promises that were made to Abraham. Here it is, folks. And he uses these words on purpose, I'm sure. He didn't just say those because it sounded like, that's what you always talked about. That's just, it was an idiom or whatever you want to call it, but there was a reason to use it.
Was that like a slight picture of the 1,000-year reign when Israel will be?
It could very well be, and in looking forward to that time, you bet.
Do you think that Solomon or any of the people around him understood the grace behind this? Because he says, I will do this for you because you have obeyed me. It wasn't that Israel had obeyed him all along the way, because if that were the case, they wouldn't have any of this, if it was reliant upon what they had done to please God.
Okay, yeah, and
wonder if they
it's
understood that.
interesting that they have this and they're enjoying it because
Yeah,
they are obeying at this point in
at
time.
this point.
And it's always interesting that the having it and having that promise and having it there and it being theirs is always unconditional. It's yours. It doesn't matter whether you're obedient or not. But being able to enjoy it, to eat and drink and live happily, requires obedience. And what you're going to see, at least in the early part of Solomon's reign, is a nation that went up and he brought all the people up and he said, we are going to pray to God because we got to start this nation out on the right foot. And Lord, I want wisdom and all that sort of thing. You've seen that? But there is a hint in this verse, if you heard it, that of what's to come. And what you see in Solomon is, it says he did all these great things, and he built the temple, and they had this worship service we're going to see when they brought that temple online, if you will. When they did all that, and how everything was so great. And then there's this little comment about some wives that he happened to have, and how it just took him right over the edge and right down. And there's a hint in this verse
Judah
of
and
that.
Judah and Israel.
Yeah, you caught that. It didn't say the nation of Israel. Earlier on it said, the beginning of this chapter, it says, now it came about after these things that God tested, oops, Abraham, I'm in the wrong chapter. It said in the beginning of, now King Solomon was king over all Israel. All Israel. And now here, Judah and Israel were as. And that every once in a while you see that there's within this nation that Solomon's holding together, everything's good right now. You watch. There's a friction there. We saw little hints of it under David as he tried to pull them together. There's always been this, I don't know, sibling rivalry. There's something there. A little bit of discomfort with Judah and the rest of the nation. Something going on. And it's that's my 5-year-old why, and that one is, why Judah and Israel? Why not just the nation of Israel was all fat and happy and everything was good? So there's a hint there that they're not one yet. And I don't think you're going to see one until a future date. And you'll see one thing. So, one little verse, one little snippet that he's trying to show us a whole lot of stuff. So, hope that doesn't totally snow you over. So now we go into verse 21, and maybe I'm a little ahead of myself. Here comes a description of where all those places that we looked at last time and how far they stretched. It says he was ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So even after he's going downhill, he still had this huge area. The river is the river Euphrates on the other side of the desert. And the Philistines' land, of course, is kind of down here. And that takes you all the way down here to the border of Egypt. Down here. So he's got a big chunk of territory that people, is either owned, conquered by them, by his father David, or at least pay tribute to this guy. So, big chunk of area. And then, this really interesting passage in verse 22. And his provisions for one day. And you go, this is weird. And Solomon's provisions for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. And then he goes on to, and he had dominion from, and you go, is your Y button getting pushed really hard? Mine is. It's like, that's weird. He tells about he had dominion of all this territory, and then it goes, and this is what he needed to keep everybody alive for a day, and then it goes back, and he had dominion from this town, which happens to be right here on the west bank of the Euphrates River, over to, and you go, that seems kind of strange to stick that in there, doesn't it? This seems almost out of place. Yes?
I think I've seen that in several places in the Bible where you'll be reading a lot, like the prayer of Jabez, for example. This was a member of this family, and then all of a sudden you get this paragraph.
Yeah. Why is that in there? Yeah. Just seems odd. But it's there, and it may actually be there for a reason, and it may be actually related a little bit to some of the other stuff when you start looking at it. So the first thing you all really wanted to know, right, what's a core?
10 bushels.
10 bushels. You looked in your margin. Actually, it may be 8 to 10 bushels.
Yeah, approximately, yeah.
Yeah. So-
This says 185.
That was for 30 cores, wasn't it?
Oh, 30.
What's a core again? I didn't hear
A
that.
core, actually, it's either, it looks like in your Bible either that way or one or the other. It has, its meaning has to do with something that is round, is a circle, and is a bundle that was basically a donkey load,
Oh.
is the way they looked at it. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it, to put on a donkey? So I don't know about the 8 to 10 bushel part, but a bunch of smart people had put their heads together and did a bunch of calculations. And so if you take their numbers and crunch them all down, and whether it's 8 bushel, 10 bushel, 6 bushel, whatever it is, and the pounds they come up with on this thing, it comes up to get a picture, if you had a semi-load of wheat for every 2 days, that's what we're talking about. It is somewhere around, if you bake all this stuff into bread, it's about 28,000 pounds per day. That's a lot of bread. So if you figure that this is also, now this is the pay for staff. Because in those days, not all pay would have been money. There may have been a little, but most of it was food and housing and things like that. So what this does for you, if you can say, they might be close on the numbers, and everybody can argue, I guess, about just how big is how much does a donkey carry and all this sort of thing. But if you figure that those guys are smart enough and they followed things through and this 28,000 pounds is right, and you go, okay, so how much would an individual get paid of that? How much a day? And so they took a guess and they said, if you give them 2 pounds per day, then that means there are 14,000 people that are on the payroll. So that gives you a little hint of the size of the administration to run a kingdom like that.
Plus he had a ton of concubines.
And he had, well, that includes them. So we know that at least, what is it, 700 of them or something, or is that the wives and concubines are additional? I kind of get my numbers mixed up there. Numbers are not my strong suit, if I have to remember them. So, yeah, that would include his immediate family, the wives and concubines, the children. It would include all the servants, all those administrators. That is a big bunch of people. That's a sizable little town that is being provided for from this whole nation. And of course, the farmer in me just couldn't stand it. I had to figure out, okay, I wonder what their yields were in those. and there's somewhere, I'm guessing that their yields were not anything close to what we get now. So, and they have some really great river valleys and places to grow things. So if this is the wheat, I'm guessing that there's somewhere around 8,400 acres dedicated just to supporting the palace. At maybe 20 bushels or so, I was guessing, a 20 bushel yield and something like that. So each one of those.
What would the percentage of land mass be for 8,400 acres? What percentage?
When you look at that, it's actually a pretty small piece of that. You think, oh man, 8,000 acres, that's huge. Of course, that's just the palace. But the interesting thing, there are some valleys in here that were fabulously productive and are even today. So in total land mass, that's not a huge amount, but
And by hand.
by hand, and yeah.
Well, and during that time, God blessed by the rains that came at the
Yes.
right time.
They had timely rains and they produced well, and they hadn't been plowing long enough to wash it all away yet, which is a whole other story. And there's a lot of those hills that used to be really productive that you can now go up into rocks and find remnants of farm equipment up there. So it's unfortunate. But these areas were hugely productive. And the other thing, though, when you think about this, it gets me, all that stuff, think of 2 semi-loads a day has to come in to here, or or at least a bunch of it. Now, some of it may have been spread out to the other various cities, you know, and peeled off, but a whole ton of it, I don't know, even if it was half.
How many donkeys in a semi-load?
You're thinking logistics of trying to move that stuff. That's a lot of donkeys. I've got to move that from all these places into Jerusalem. Yeah, and you got to feed the donkeys. Yeah. And on top of that, then you have, think about this, every day you've got 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture fed, so you got 30 head of cattle that have to be brought in and slaughtered every day, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl for special occasions. And the fattened fowl, I bet there was a whole paragraph on that word that nobody's really sure exactly what it means. Some people think geese, some people think other things, you know, some kind of birds anyway. So you have all these, either the wild game, and you have all the cattle and the sheep, and it doesn't mention goats. They must have had goats.
They have in my Bible, it says goats.
Goats and goats, okay.
This would be pretty nice, big men for that. You could eat pretty well.
You could have
Make
eaten
my mouth water.
that eat, drink, and be merry. They really were.
They were probably a pretty hefty bunch of folks.
Rugby team.
Yeah, they weren't off packing it all in and packing it all in.
They walked everywhere.
Yeah. You wonder why down on one end of the, in fact, there's a couple of gates within the city of Jerusalem have an interesting name. They are the dung gates. Imagine why. There's a lot to pack out because a lot's coming through.
How long was their lifespan, I wonder, an average?
But, you know, during that period of time, I'm not sure whether Solomon exemplifies the average lifespan, you know, of 60 or so years, or whether it was shorter or longer. I'm not sure. So, but when you start thinking about this, the thing that it'd be interesting to nail that down. How many donkey trains, how many, but it starts to make you see why, one, they had the city of stores, like Megiddo was one of them. It was a place where food was brought. It looks right out on the valley there where Armageddon will take place. So Megiddo is right there. It sits right off of this valley right here. It sits right there. And so you've got this store city that stuff is brought into, and then these guys are responsible then for seeing that their share gets shipped into Jerusalem in time and to supply the king with what he needs. And just think about the administration and the communication in days without cell phones. How in the world did they do that? And no semi-trucks, so, camel trains and donkey trains and all that sort of thing. What you start to get to realize, because that didn't even mention any vegetable crops or fruits or any of the pomegranates and the grapes and the other things. This is the staples they're talking about here. So there's a lot of other stuff, and all of it is going up and down the highway and through. What it does for me is I tend to think of this as oh man, you're out in remote areas and it's desolate and there's no people around, and and it wasn't that way at all. You are in the middle of people coming and going, there's stuff happening, and news is traveling because the donkey trains and the camel trains and the traders from outside that are coming through doing trade, that are crossing through just to go to Egypt and back up here and back over here. This was like Grand Central Station here. It just boggles the mind, the amount of stuff that's going on within this little piece of real estate.
They were supposed to witness to the outside world, and that would be the way to do it, is through the trade people.
Yeah, it's like God just said, here it is. You'll all just get, everybody's going to get a funnel through there. They're going to be paying tribute, and it's your chance to say, here is why things are so great. Here is the testimony we have. This is what our God is doing. Here's what our God has promised. And it's really amazing when you think of these kind of numbers and stuff just for that. It really boggles the mind. So I think he put it there on purpose so you could get an idea, a little sampling of the craziness and the busyness around this capital, and that it was a major undertaking. And it goes on then to re-emphasize that he had dominion over everything west of the river from Tiphsah even to Gaza. So Tiphsah is over here on the Euphrates on the western bank, and Gaza is where it still is today. You've heard of the Gaza Strip, way down there on the coast. And so he kind of gave you the northeast and the southwest. I guess he must think on an angle, whereas the rest of us are east to west, north, south. This writer was kind of giving you the slant on this thing, if you will. So, and over all the kings west of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. All the fighting that David did resulted in peace for the time that Solomon's in control. And there's a couple of guys that snuck out of town in order for that. And I mean, because of the influence and the power, there were some guys that will come in later that are right now, at least one sitting down here in Egypt, and we'll see him later. He's sitting down here biding his time because the heat got put on him, and he cleared out. And there's another one that was over here, and he got out by the skin of his teeth, and he took off, and he's sitting out there biding his time and waiting. And God's going to use them later. But right now, he's got a lot of peace.
This is a perfect example. Remember Samuel, when they wanted the king so bad, he told them what was going to happen. This is a perfect example of it. They're going to be taxed. You're
going to be providing for that king.
For everything.
Yeah, and they're going to see that even more as we'll see it. They're already seeing it in this time period, because at the same time, we're building a temple and a palace and a city wall and all this stuff that he was doing. In the midst of all this traffic, if that weren't enough, there's a major construction project going on in Jerusalem. So you kind of have to stick that in the back of your mind too, that all this is going on at once. It's incredible. So, tells us that Judah and Israel, again, interesting, they're separate, lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. So Dan, here's our north and south. Here's Dan is up here, somewhere about there. And Beersheba is right down here. And they all had a vine and a fig tree, right? Isn't that what you wanted? What in the world is that all about? Vine and a fig tree. What kind of
security?
Security. And not only just security, the vine is more than just food. It's also the source of the wine, but it's a sign of joy, happiness, same sort of thing we saw before. You know, you've got a vine, you're really well off.
Can I ask a stupid question?
I love stupid questions, because that's the kind I ask.
I was looking, okay, I should know this. Did they have slaves then? I mean, in that area?
Good question.
It is?
Yeah. They actually do.
Okay.
And they are from
Ah,
all the nations, the peoples they were supposed to conquer and wipe out, and they didn't always, but they made slaves out of a bunch of them. And a bunch of those folks are also engaged in building that temple. So yes, they did. They did have slaves. So, a lot of stuff going on. So Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon, and the vine and the fig tree, there's prosperity. This is the chicken in every pot, and it's even beyond that. It's the Cadillac in every driveway, in front of the McMansion. That's kind of the drift of what he's saying. It was really good during this period of time. This was the golden age for the nation. We'll see how long it lasts. So then it goes on to another odd thing. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. big deal. Well, actually, 40,000 is probably a copy of Sayre. If you go to the parallel passage in the next book over, you'll find out that they say 4,000, and everybody tends to agree that 4,000 is probably a better number. So, big deal. We had 4,000 stalls, horses, and 12,000 horsemen, and he had chariots.
More people to feed, more animals to take care of.
More feed, more animals, things to take care of. But why would that have been a big deal?
Well, he was
Worth
supposed to
mentioning.
multiply horses and chariots.
And he's supposed to have his strength elsewhere.
You're right.
But what are, yeah,
Their defense. Their defense. Right.
defensive. So if you have horses and chariots, you've got what today? Today might be drones and smart bombs. This is high-tech, latest thing, most impressive, frightening thing out there on the battlefield. We saw it coming in with David, that, you know, when the enemy came in and they had chariots and we didn't, you know, it was tough sailing against that. And so this is something that it appears that Solomon may even had the corner on the market, if you will. And they've actually found, and now there's disagreement about what age they are, but at Megiddo and other places, they have found things that were clearly stables for large numbers of horses, laid out pretty fancy. Very much like what you would think of a stable this day, with a 10 by 10 stall for each horse, set in groups that might have kept the horses together, that served in a team for a chariot, that you would have 2 or 3 together. Those horses had to learn to work together in close proximity. They would stall them together in groups and all these sort of things. And people are arguing now about, okay, are those 10th century, or are they 9th century? Are they in 10th century, puts them in Solomon's time, 9th century puts them a little later in Jeroboam II's reign. Where did these things get built? And some of them think that there's a second layer underneath the 9th century stuff that they believe they found that actually is, they upgraded and rebuilt right over the top of the old foundation. So really interesting reading out there that you can go out, and they had these horses and chariots. They're kind of expensive. And I think if you go over to, I think it's chapter 10, if I remember right. I think I got into his foreign wives by that time, but I was thinking I was 10 that had his chariot.
Yeah, 26.
Is it 26? Thank you. Oh, I'm in chapter 11. No wonder it's not working. Yeah, and Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Wow. That's a whole bunch of 1,400 chariots. You know, how many horses does that take? Well, at least 2,800, because you got to have at least 2, and some of them believe you may have had 3, and you may have had to have reserves and all those sort of things. And it appears horses were a big, big business, and it talked to their...
Verse 29 tells you well.
Go ahead, would you read that too?
At that time, Egyptian chariots delivered to Jerusalem could be purchased for 600 pieces of silver, and the horses could be bought for 150 pieces of silver.
So there you go, 600 pieces. Chariots cost a lot more than horses. Isn't that the same way it is now? You can buy the engine a lot cheaper than you can buy the whole car. But in fact, the things I was reading says Egypt was noted for its skill in making the wheels. Really fast chariots for hunting and for warfare. So remember, we had this little connection with Egypt down here, with the princess being married to Solomon. And then he gets his chariots from Egypt for 600 pieces of silver. And he picks his horses up from elsewhere where they were famously bred And there's quite a trade going on in military hardware that he's involved with, and he's got a fair stock of them himself. So
That stuff was pretty well useless right there in Jerusalem, though, wasn't it?
you would think in the hill country in Jerusalem it would not be as useful as in the battlefield plains, and that's why I wonder if like Megiddo, it has these great big stalls, and it's on a tell, it's on a hill, if you will, they built the cities up. But when they dig down, here are these layers of they're pretty certain they're stables, and it's looking right over the plain there. So it would make sense that his main areas to have them is out where they are more useful, though he had horses, of course, at Jerusalem, whether he had chariots more than... We know that there were a few chariots or carriages around because Absalom and his brother both got themselves a nice black limo chariot and flagmen and runners, and they were running them through the city. So while they weren't as tactically as good in the hills, they were still around. So they would have had some probably. So we're running out of time, and we go, well, isn't that fascinating? Isn't that a big deal? Why do we care?
I think it's interesting.
It is fascinating. It's really interesting. It's really hard sometimes, though, to try to figure out, so why is God telling us? Well, we've spent a lot of time kind of bored in on the, the little picture, and you kind of got to back off and see the bigger picture and say, does God deliver on what he promises? And I think that's what the writer is trying to show us, is you've got to see what God did for this guy. It's going to go on, and it's going to talk about his knowledge in the areas of botany and biology and engineering and all those things. This guy was blessed with an incredible knowledge of a whole lot of stuff, and it was for one purpose, and that's where Solomon missed the boat. He forgot what the purpose of all this thing was.
Well, unfortunately, even seeing David's problems that developed because of his habits, unfortunately, he followed the same pattern.
He had the same problem as his father David, which is the same problem that everybody's had forever, as he has an old sin nature. It isn't gone yet. And when things are good and things are easy, it's hard to stay focused, I think. And what we're really going to see here is that he had a difficult time staying focused. So, kind of a warning to us, if you look around and life is good, take care. Watch yourself.
It's said that riches are a greater time when we can fall than it is when we're in trouble, and that we run to the Lord.
Yeah.
We stay close to him, but when everything's going well,
We're fine.
we don't need God.
Isn't that true? I mean, when we get forced to our knees is when things are difficult, when there's things that are beyond our ability to handle. And then as soon as the pressure backs off, you just kind of ease back a little bit, and next thing you know, that little note about Judah and Israel just keeps popping up. And we're going to see that pop up really big down the road away. But there's, in the meantime, we're going to see a lot of success that he has, and we're going to get to follow through, and we'll watch how God developed his plan, how he built the temple, and what he intended to do for the nation, even right then. They kind of missed the boat on, but still, it's pretty amazing what God does with this man Solomon. And we'll pick it up next time and see where we can end up. Let's close. Father, we thank you for our time together this morning. And it is easy to get buried in the minutia and the detail, and it's interesting and fascinating and fun to go see if there's bits and fragments of archaeology that support some of this stuff, which is always fun to find. But we also know that you had a plan, and what we're watching is the unfolding of your plan, of your looking forward to the cross and even on beyond, when the King of Kings and Lord of Lords would rule and reign on the earth. And you're giving us a small snapshot, as you gave the nation of Israel, of what that was going to look like when your righteous king would rule. pray, Father, that you would help us to understand how that relates to us today, the blessings you promised us that we might enjoy, and how we enter into those, that we might be able to be about our Father's business of being a witness and a light to those that God brings by our paths. We just thank you for our time together this morning, in Jesus' name.